All right, let's go. Number 10. The sawing. The question that no executioner in the Holy Roman Empire ever recorded an answer to is this: at what point during the vertical bisection of a living human body does consciousness end? The method was reserved for crimes beyond ordinary treason. The condemned was stripped, bound at the ankles, and suspended upside down from a wooden frame. A large two-handled saw was positioned at the groin. Two executioners began pulling the blade downward through the center of the body. The inversion was not cruelty added to cruelty, it was precision. With the body inverted, blood pooled in the brain instead of draining from the wound. The condemned did not lose consciousness when the cutting started. That was the point. The question was never whether they suffered. It was how far down the blade could travel before the brain finally went dark. The scaffold was assembled the same way a market stall was assembled. The same town square. The same municipal workers. In some jurisdictions, the executioner held a salaried civic position, ranked alongside the bridge keeper and the night watchman. Crowds gathered for executions the way they gathered for seasonal fairs. Children were present. Street vendors worked the perimeter. Food was sold. The atmosphere was not solemn. It was administrative. A sentence had been handed down, and the community was expected to witness its enforcement the way it witnessed a land survey or a tax collection. The modern equivalent is not a courtroom. It is a city council meeting that happens to include a killing. The familiarity of the setting is what makes the next part difficult to absorb. This was not hidden. This was not exceptional. This was a Tuesday in a town that had budgeted for it. The condemned hung inverted, arms dangling toward the ground, face swelling and darkening, as blood pressure built rapidly in the skull. The saw was not a surgical instrument. It was a timber saw, coarse-toothed, built for cutting green wood. Two executioners gripped one handle each and pulled in alternating rhythm. The first cuts opened the skin and muscle tissue between the legs. The body's own weight held it in position against the blade. No additional restraint beyond the ankle bindings was required. Gravity did the work. The blade moved slowly. Witnesses across multiple accounts described the sounds changing as the saw passed through different tissue densities. Skin and fat parted with relative quiet. Muscle offered more resistance, a wet tearing sound punctuated by the rasp of the saw teeth. Then bone. The pelvic bone stopped the rhythm entirely. The executioners had to reset, lean into the handles, and force the blade through. The sound carried across the square, and throughout these first minutes, the condemned remained fully conscious, fully aware of the positioning, fully aware of the sound, fully aware of what the sound meant. The inverted body ensured continuous blood supply to the brain, even as everything below the blade was being separated. The screaming did not stop when the cutting began. It changed pitch. How far could the blade travel before awareness ended? The honest answer is that no one precisely recorded the threshold, but the anatomy suggests a grim window. The major blood vessels of the pelvis and lower abdomen, the iliac arteries and the inferior vena cava, sit deep within the trunk. The saw would pass through skin, subcutaneous fat, muscle, and pelvic bone before reaching them. If the executioners worked slowly, the blood loss from superficial tissue would not be immediately fatal. The body would lose blood, but the inverted position would keep the brain perfused, even as the lower cavity opened. Some period accounts suggest the condemned remained conscious as the blade reached the navel. Others suggest further. The distance from the groin to the navel is roughly the length of a human forearm. That is the minimum distance of conscious experience during this procedure. The maximum remains unknown because no one conducting it had any reason to record the moment consciousness ceased. Forensic pathologist Raoul Perot, writing from the University of Lyon in 2003, noted that inverted suspension could theoretically sustain brain perfusion well into the abdominal cavity, extending consciousness far beyond what an upright posture would permit. The question no account has ever satisfactorily answered is how medieval executioners arrived at the inversion technique in the first place. The anatomical knowledge required is specific. Keeping the body upright during vertical bisection would have resulted in rapid blood pressure loss to the brain and unconsciousness within seconds. Inversion solved that problem. But understanding why inversion solved it requires a functional grasp of gravity, blood pressure, and cerebral perfusion that was not formally described in medical literature for centuries. Someone, at some point, determined that an inverted body stayed awake longer. The method by which that knowledge was acquired is not something any record addresses, But here is where the standard reading of sawing as pure sadism falls apart. The method was not applied indiscriminately. It was reserved for a narrow band of offenses: heresy, treason, witchcraft, crimes against the sovereign order or the divine order. The inversion was not merely anatomical, it was theological. In medieval Christian jurisprudence, the inverted body represented the soul turned away from God. St. Peter, according to tradition, requested to be crucified upside down as an expression of spiritual humility. The inversion of the condemned during sawing carried the same symbolic grammar, but in reverse. The sinner's body was displayed in the orientation the court believed the soul already occupied. The physical act of cutting downward through an inverted figure was not punishment alone, it was correction. The executioners were not simply killing, they were performing a liturgical operation on a body the court had declared to be spiritually misaligned. The saw was not an instrument of punishment, it was a sacramental tool. The pain was not a byproduct of the method, it was doctrinally required. A civilization examined the worst physical suffering it could engineer, and classified that suffering as restoration, not the death. The suffering. The condemned was not being removed from the world. The condemned was being realigned within it. The fact that the blade moved slowly, that consciousness was sustained, that the crowd stood and watched, these were not failures of mercy. They were features of the theology. A culture looked at a screaming, bisected human being and called it a spiritual correction. The saw is gone. The scaffold is gone. The theological framework that made the suffering sacred is still legible in the court records. The blade was never the point. The doctrine was. Number 9. The pressing. On September 19, 1692, in Salem, Massachusetts, an 81-year-old farmer named Giles Corey was led into a field adjacent to the Salem jail. He had been accused of witchcraft during the trials that had seized the colony for months. The court demanded that he enter a plea. Guilty or not guilty. Corey refused. He stood before the magistrate and said nothing. The court then invoked an ancient English statute that had crossed the Atlantic with the colonists, a procedure so old that its Norman French name had survived intact for 4 centuries. What happened next would take 2 days, and it began with a single wooden board placed flat across an old man's chest. The legal mechanism was exacting. Under English common law, a trial could not proceed without a plea from the accused. No plea meant no trial. No trial meant no conviction. And no conviction meant the accused's estate could not be seized by the Crown or, in colonial Massachusetts, by the local authorities. The procedure for compelling a plea was called peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment. The accused was laid on the ground. A wooden board was placed across the chest. Stones were added, one at a time, with intervals between each addition. At each interval, the question was repeated. How do you plead? The pressing continued until the accused either entered a plea or died. This was not an improvisation born of hysteria. It was codified English law that had been practiced for centuries. The Salem court was following procedure. That is the part that should be difficult to accept. Every stone was legal. The first stones were heavy but manageable. The human rib cage is an engineering marvel, a flexible lattice of bone and cartilage capable of supporting significant distributed weight before structural failure. Corey lay in the open field with a board across his torso and the weight of several large field stones pressing down. His breathing was labored but functional. The sheriff asked for his plea. Corey did not respond. More stones were added. Neighbors watched from the edges of the field. Some had known Corey for decades. By the end of the first day, the weight on his chest was sufficient that witnesses described his face as deeply discolored, almost black. His breathing was audible from across the field, a wet, compressed sound that came in shorter and shorter intervals, like a bellows being slowly crushed. The sheriff asked again, and Corey's response, according to multiple contemporary accounts, consisted of 3 words: more weight. The pressing continued through the night and into the second day. No one relieved the weight. No one adjusted the stones. The body beneath them was slowly flattening. By the second afternoon, Corey's ribcage had fractured in multiple locations. His tongue protruded from his mouth under the pressure. The sheriff reportedly pushed it back in with the end of his cane. The crowd had thinned by then. Some could not watch any longer. Others stayed, unable to leave, caught between horror and the dawning recognition that the old man was not going to speak. He did not speak. Giles Corey died on September 19, 1692, without ever entering a plea. The entire process had taken approximately 48 hours. The weight at the time of death was never precisely recorded, but historical estimates place it in the range of 400 pounds. That is roughly the weight of a full-grown male lion distributed across the chest of an 81-year-old man for 2 days. Robert Califf, a Boston merchant and contemporary chronicler of the Salem trials, documented the Corey pressing in his 1697 account. His record remains one of the most detailed first-hand sources on peine forte et dure ever practiced in the American colonies. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Corey was not enduring. He was calculating. Under the legal framework he faced, a man who died without entering a plea died without conviction. Without conviction, his property was protected from forfeiture. Corey had deeded his considerable farm to his sons-in-law just days before the pressing began. He had arranged the transfer while he still had the legal standing to do so. Every stone the sheriff added was confirmation that Corey's strategy was working. The court needed his voice. His silence was the only weapon the system had not accounted for. The most agonizing death available to the colonial legal apparatus was, for this illiterate 81-year-old farmer, the rational choice. The system had been designed across centuries to make silence unbearable, and a man with no legal training, no formal education, and no resources beyond a farm and a family had found the flaw in the architecture. The pressing was built to break the will. Corey did not resist it. He used it. The stones accumulated for 2 days. The question was asked and asked and asked again. Not a single stone produced the word the court required. The record shows the weight. The record shows the duration. The record shows every interval at which the question was posed. What the record does not show, and what no legal system has ever been able to capture, is what it costs a man to choose the slowest available death because the alternative would have cost the people who survived him everything. Number 8. The gibbeting. 11 days. That is the survival estimate recorded in multiple accounts of live gibbeting across medieval and early modern Europe. 11 days locked inside a fitted iron cage, suspended from a wooden post at a public crossroads, with no food, no water, and no possibility of changing position. The human body can survive approximately 3 days without water under normal conditions. Inside an iron cage in direct sunlight, with the metal radiating stored heat long after sunset, 3 days is generous. Yet the accounts persist. 11 days. The number should not exist. And it requires an explanation that straightforward physiology cannot provide. The likely answer is weather. Rain falling on the cage and being licked from the iron bars could extend survival by days. The body does not care about dignity. It cares about moisture. The cage was built for the condemned before the execution. A blacksmith took measurements the way a tailor takes measurements, not for comfort but for fit. The iron bands followed the contours of the torso, the legs, the arms. Some cages included a bracket around the skull that prevented the occupant from turning or lowering the head. Others left the head free, which was not a kindness. It meant the face was accessible. The cage was tight enough to prevent sitting, tight enough to prevent shifting weight from one leg to the other, tight enough that the arms could not be raised above the waist. The condemned entered the cage standing and would remain standing until the legs buckled, at which point the cage held the body upright anyway. The fit ensured that collapse did not mean rest. It meant hanging from the iron by the pressure points where flesh met metal. The gibbet was erected at crossroads, harbor entrances, town gates, or hilltops. Maximum visibility was the entire point. Travelers would see the silhouette from a distance first, then hear the occupant, before they could resolve the shape. The first day, the sounds were recognizable: shouting, pleading, cursing, bargaining with anyone who passed. By the second day, the shouting had become intermittent, interrupted by long silences that were worse than the noise. By the third day, the sounds emerging from the cage were no longer language. They were involuntary, a dry rasping, a low moan that the wind sometimes carried across entire fields. Children walked past the gibbet on their way to school. Families ate supper within earshot. The smell of a body decomposing while its owner was still alive became a fixed feature of the local landscape. No one moved the gibbet. No one covered it. The gibbet was not an event. It was furniture. The corvids arrived early. Crows and ravens are opportunistic feeders, and they did not wait for the occupant to die. They began with the soft tissue of the face, particularly the eyes, often while the condemned was still conscious and responsive. The hands, which protruded through gaps in the cage bars, were next. The condemned could flex their fingers but could not pull their hands inside the cage. Accounts from multiple regions describe the frantic wiggling of fingers as birds landed on the cage bars and began to feed. The wiggling eventually stopped. The birds did not. A surviving gibbet cage held in the Markisches Museum in Berlin, dated to approximately the 16th century, shows construction consistent with these accounts. The ironwork is not crude. It is articulated, fitted, and engineered for a single sustained use. But here is where the reading of gibbeting as a deterrent collapses under its own evidence. The cage did not kill. Nothing inside the cage caused death. Exposure killed. Thirst killed. The birds killed. Shock killed. The cage simply removed every defense the body might mount against any of them. The condemned could not flee, could not fight, could not curl up against the cold, could not shield the face from the sun or the birds, could not reach water even if water was inches away. The cage was not a weapon. It was the systematic subtraction of every option except endurance, and the engineering of that subtraction was precise. The fit of the iron ensured that no posture offered relief. No position reduced the exposure. The cage did not hurt. It simply ensured that everything else could. When endurance finally failed, the cage held the corpse in place, for months, sometimes for years, until the iron corroded or the post fell. Travelers who passed the gibbet 6 months after the execution saw the same silhouette against the sky. The shape was still human. The occupant was not. The bones were still held upright by the iron that had held the living body upright. The punishment did not end when the person ended. It continued as architecture, as landscape, as a shape on the horizon that meant the same thing whether the remains inside were 6 days old or 6 months old. The person was temporary. The cage was municipal. Number 7. The flaying. In 1845, the British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard was cataloging stone relief panels from the ruins of the palace of Ashur-Nasir-Pal II at Nimrud, in what is now northern Iraq. The reliefs depicted the standard visual vocabulary of Assyrian imperial power: military campaigns, tribute processions, royal lion hunts. Among the panels, Layard noted one that he initially interpreted as depicting a figure removing a garment from a prisoner of war. On closer inspection, the garment was not a garment. The figure was removing the prisoner's skin, and the anatomical detail carved into the stone was precise enough to suggest that the sculptor had either witnessed the procedure firsthand or had been given instructions by someone who had. The scene on the relief was not displayed in a private chamber or a restricted archive. It was placed in the throne room, the most public space in the palace, where foreign ambassadors, vassal kings, and tribute bearers from across the empire would stand before the Assyrian king and see it behind him. That placement was not incidental. The Assyrian Empire governed a territory stretching from the Tigris River to the Mediterranean coast, and its administrative language was demonstrable force. Flaying appeared in royal annals alongside casualty figures and deportation totals. The scribes recorded it the way they recorded grain inventories and labor conscriptions. It was not spectacle, it was policy, and the policy was carved in stone so that no visitor could claim they had not been informed. The anatomy of the process determined whether the victim survived for minutes or for hours. The skin is the largest organ in the human body, covering roughly 1.7 square meters on an average adult. That is approximately the surface area of a standard interior door. Removal typically began at the extremities, the forearms and lower legs, where the skin is thinnest and separates more readily from the underlying fascia. A skilled practitioner could maintain a slow, even tension, peeling rather than cutting, keeping the sheet intact. Speed was the critical variable. Too fast, and blood loss from torn capillaries became catastrophic. Too deep, and the blade hit muscle, causing shock. The objective, when prolonged survival was the goal, was a consistent shallow separation that exposed the deeper layers without severing major vessels. Once the skin was removed from a section, the underlying dermis and muscle tissue lay open to the air. The nerve density of these exposed layers is orders of magnitude higher than the surface skin. Sensations that the intact skin would register as mild, a light breeze, a change in humidity, the landing of an insect, became signals of acute and overwhelming pain. The body began losing fluid through the exposed surface at a rate that made dehydration inevitable within hours. Core temperature dropped as the body's thermal insulation vanished. Hypothermia could set in even in warm climates. The victim was simultaneously dehydrating and freezing. The removed skin was not discarded. In several documented cases, it was preserved and nailed to the walls of conquered cities or draped over statues at the gates. The victim and the skin served the same administrative function, but in different locations. One warned the city, the other warned everyone approaching it. In 2015, a team from the British Museum led by Dr. Sarah Collins completed a detailed analysis of the Assyrian relief panels depicting flaying. Their findings confirmed that the anatomical detail in the carvings was consistent with direct observation, not artistic convention. The tools depicted matched the incision patterns rendered in the stone. But here is where the reading of flaying as extreme cruelty collapses into something more unsettling. The reliefs do not depict frenzy. They depict procedure. The figures performing the flaying are composed. Their postures are stable and balanced. They are working methodically, with specific tools, in a consistent sequence across multiple panels. Someone had codified the technique. Someone had trained the practitioners. And the empire chose to display that fact in the most public room in the palace. The message was not that the Assyrians were capable of rage. Every empire is capable of rage. The message was that this was not rage. This was competence. The Assyrians did not flay their enemies because they hated them. Hatred is disorganized. They flayed their enemies because they needed the world to understand what a stable, well-administered state could do to a human body when it allocated the resources to do so. The skin on the wall was not a trophy of war. It was a letter of reference. The empire was not advertising cruelty. It was advertising capability. Every strip removed from a living prisoner was evidence not of madness but of institutional precision, of a system that could train a man to remove another man's skin the way it trained a scribe to record barley shipments. And that is what makes the reliefs in the British Museum difficult to look at even now. Not the suffering on the prisoner's face, the calm on the face of the man holding the blade. Number 6. The crucifixion. In 1953, a French surgeon named Pierre Barbet published the results of a study that had occupied him for over a decade. Working from the St. Joseph Hospital in Paris, Barbet had been investigating a question that centuries of theology, devotional art, and religious commentary had never managed to answer with clinical precision. The question was mechanical, not spiritual. What is the actual physiological cause of death in crucifixion? The answer he arrived at overturned the popular understanding that had persisted for nearly 2,000 years. The condemned did not bleed to death. They did not die of infection, shock, or exposure. They asphyxiated, slowly, over hours or days, and the mechanism by which they asphyxiated was something no one had fully described before. Everyone assumes they understand crucifixion, the cross, the nails, the exposure, the slow, passive weakening under sun and wind. The image is so deeply embedded in Western visual culture that most people have never paused to examine the mechanics beneath the symbol. The Romans did not design crucifixion to wound. They designed it to position. The body was affixed to the cross with the arms extended and elevated, the feet fixed to the lower vertical beam. In that configuration, the full weight of the torso pulled the chest cavity into a state of near-permanent inhalation. The intercostal muscles and the diaphragm, the two structures responsible for active breathing, were stretched to a position from which they could not contract effectively. The lungs could fill passively as the chest expanded under gravity, but they could not empty. To exhale, the condemned had to push upward against the nail or nails through the feet, temporarily lifting the body and releasing the gravitational tension on the chest wall. Each breath out was a voluntary act requiring extraordinary effort and producing extraordinary pain. Each breath in happened only because the condemned chose to push. This cycle, push, exhale, sag, struggle to inhale, push again, could continue for hours. In some documented cases, it continued for days. The Romans understood the variables, and they adjusted them. A small wooden peg called the sedial was sometimes mounted on the vertical beam, positioned beneath the buttocks to partially support the body's weight. The sedial was not mercy, it was a calibration tool. By reducing the effort required to push upward, the sedial extended the duration of the breathing cycle, which extended the execution by hours or even days. The opposite intervention existed as well. The CRUCIFIXION, the deliberate breaking of the legs with an iron bar, removed the condemned's ability to push up entirely. Once the legs were shattered, the chest sagged permanently into the inhale position, and death by asphyxiation followed within minutes. The Romans could extend or abbreviate the process at will. They had engineered a dial into the method. The cross was adjustable. The scale of Roman crucifixion is what the individual horror obscures. After the slave rebellion led by Spartacus was crushed in 71 BCE, the general Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered the crucifixion of approximately 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way. The road from Rome to Capua stretches roughly 200 kilometers. That is 124 miles. 6,000 crosses lining a road that long means a cross approximately every 33 meters, every 100 feet. A traveler walking the Appian Way in the weeks after the rebellion would pass a dying or recently dead body every 20 paces, for days of walking, without interruption. The road was not decorated with the dead. The road was made of them. The crosses were not punishment for 6,000 individuals. They were a public works project. The road itself became the sentence. Dr. Frederick Zugabe, chief medical examiner of Rockland County, New York, confirmed Barbate's core findings in a 2005 study using physiological modeling and suspension experiments. Death by crucifixion was death by asphyxiation, brought on by the progressive failure of the condemned to perform the muscular work of breathing. But here is where the conventional understanding of crucifixion as passive suffering collapses entirely. The condemned did not hang and slowly weaken. That narrative is a comforting simplification. The condemned made a decision, repeatedly, for hours or days. Push up, endure the pain in the feet, breathe, or stop pushing, stop breathing, and die. Every single breath drawn on the cross was a voluntary choice to continue living inside the pain for one more cycle. The Romans had not designed a method that killed slowly. They had designed a method that forced the condemned to actively participate in their own survival, breath by breath, push by push, until the muscles of the legs could no longer generate the force required to lift the body one more time. The cross did not kill. The body killed itself. It died of exhaustion, of the inability to perform the effort that breathing required. The nails were not the mechanism of death. The geometry was. The angle of the arms, the height of the feet, the precise relationship between body weight and respiratory mechanics that converted breathing from a reflex into labor and labor into a countdown. A civilization measured those angles. A civilization tested those distances. A civilization calibrated the relationship between mass and suffocation so precisely that the margin between living and dying fit inside a single push of the legs. Then they lined the most important road in the empire with 6,000 demonstrations, each body dying at a rate it controlled. The most engineered component of the cross was never the wood or the iron. It was the silence between one breath and the decision to take another. Number 5. The STRAPPADO, 7.5 kilograms per square centimeter. That is the approximate force required to dislocate a human shoulder from its socket when the arm is pulled rearward and upward behind the back. The number comes from modern orthopedic research on joint failure thresholds. It is a clean, clinical figure. It does not convey what the number feels like. In the interrogation rooms of the medieval and early modern Inquisition, that threshold was crossed deliberately, repeatedly, and on a schedule. The method was called strappado. The condemned's hands were tied behind the back. A rope was attached to the bound wrists and threaded through a ceiling pulley. The body was hoisted until the feet left the ground, the full weight of the torso suspended from the shoulders in a position the joint was never designed to bear. Then the body was dropped. The fall stopped short of the floor. The jolt dislocated both shoulders simultaneously. And then someone reset them. And then it happened again. The institutional setting is the first thing that separates strappado from the other methods on this list. The strappado was not an execution. It was a questioning technique. The Inquisition did not use it to kill. It used it to extract. And because extraction required a living, conscious, responsive subject, the institution developed protocols to ensure that the body survived the process long enough to produce usable testimony. There were rules, written rules. How many drops per session? How much rest between sessions? How much weight could be attached to the feet to increase the force of the drop? The documentation was meticulous. The Inquisition was not operating in secret. It was operating in triplicate. The modern parallel is not a dungeon. It is an HR department with a different definition of compliance. The first drop was the worst, only in the sense that the body had not yet learned what was coming. The rope went taut. The feet left the floor. The shoulders bore the full weight of the body in posterior extension. The joint capsule stretched, then tore, then gave way entirely. Both arms wrenched from their sockets with a sound that witnesses consistently described as audible from outside the room. The pain was immediate and total. The body convulsed involuntarily. The condemned screamed. The interrogator asked the question. If no satisfactory answer came, the body was lowered. The shoulders were manually forced back into their sockets, a process that was itself agonizing, and the condemned was given a rest period. The rest period was mandated, not by compassion, by protocol. A subject who lost consciousness from pain or shock could not answer questions. The rest was functional. It was reload time. The weighted variant increased the stakes with each session. Iron weights or stones were attached to the feet before the hoist. The additional mass increased the force of the drop and the violence of the dislocation. The Inquisition maintained gradations. 5 pounds for the first session, 10 for the second, 15 for the third. The weights were not chosen arbitrarily. They were calibrated to the body's deteriorating tolerances. Each successive dislocation damaged the joint capsule further. The ligaments stretched and tore. The rotator cuff shredded. The nerves running through the brachial plexus, the network of nerves controlling the arm, hand, and fingers, were compressed, stretched, and eventually damaged beyond recovery. Permanent loss of arm function was common among survivors. The Inquisition's own records acknowledge this. The damage was not a failure of the method. It was an expected outcome, noted in the files the way a mechanic notes wear on a part that has exceeded its service life. Historian Henry Charles Lea, writing from the University of Pennsylvania in 1888, compiled the most comprehensive analysis of Inquisition interrogation protocols from primary source documents. His findings confirmed that the strappado was the single most frequently employed coercive technique across multiple Inquisition jurisdictions spanning 3 centuries. But here is where the standard reading of the strappado as brutal torture collapses into something colder. The Inquisition records do not read like the testimony of sadists. They read like maintenance logs. Session lengths were recorded in minutes. Weight specifications were documented in pounds. Recovery periods between sessions were mandated in hours. The institution had studied the mechanical tolerances of the human shoulder joint and designed a protocol that operated precisely inside the margin between maximum pain and permanent system failure. The strappado was not violence. It was quality control. The body was the product. The information was the output. The rope and the pulley were the tooling. The documents survive. The session logs, the weight tables, the mandated rest intervals. They sit in archives across Southern Europe, written in the careful hand of clerks who recorded the proceedings the way they recorded any other institutional activity. They read like the service records of a machine. The machine was a human body. The Inquisition had not invented cruelty. Every civilization on this list had cruelty. The Inquisition had industrialized it. It had added rest periods so the body could heal enough to be broken again. It had added weight tables so the force could be increased without killing the subject. It had added session limits so the interrogator could return the next day to a subject who was still capable of speech. The horror of the strappado is not in the rope. It is not in the drop. It is not in the sound the shoulders make when they leave the socket. The horror is in the rest period. The hours of silence between sessions that were not relief. They were scheduled maintenance. Number 4. The breaking on the wheel. In 1532, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V published the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, a comprehensive criminal code intended to standardize judicial practice across the fragmented German territories. The document addressed theft, fraud, assault, perjury, and dozens of other offenses in dry administrative language. Among its provisions, in sections that read with the same bureaucratic tone as the passages on property disputes, was a detailed specification for execution by the wheel, the number of blows, the sequence of limbs, the instrument to be used, and a single variable that the sentencing judge was required to decide in advance, a variable that determined whether the condemned would die in minutes or survive in agony for days. The variable had a name. It was called the retentum. The method began on the ground. The condemned was spread across a wooden frame or directly on the earth, arms and legs extended and secured to iron stakes. A heavy cartwheel, sometimes iron shod, sometimes a purpose-built iron bar, was raised and dropped onto the limbs in a prescribed sequence. The sequence was not left to the executioner's discretion. It was specified by the court. Shins first, then thighs, then forearms, then upper arms. The order mattered because a blow to the chest or skull too early would end the process prematurely. The legal code specified the progression from extremities inward precisely to maximize the duration of consciousness during the procedure. Each blow shattered the bone beneath the impact point. The connective tissue and muscle absorbed part of the force, which meant the breaks were not clean. They were comminuted, splintered, the bone fragmenting inside the intact limb like gravel inside a sock. The condemned felt each one. The sequence ensured it. After the bones were broken, the body was threaded through the spokes of a large wagon wheel, the shattered limbs woven between the wooden bars in a grotesque braid. The wheel was then mounted on a tall pole and elevated above the crowd. The condemned, still alive, was raised into the air like a flag. Survival in this state was documented. Hours in some cases, days in others. Exposed to sun, wind, rain, and birds, the body hung broken but breathing on the wheel above the town square, while daily commerce continued beneath it. Market stalls opened. Goods were sold. The wheel turned slowly on its pole when the wind caught it. The condemned watched the town continue without them. The sounds of ordinary life reached them from below. No one climbed up. No one offered water. The elevation was not decorative. It ensured that the suffering was visible from every approach to the town. The retentum was the mercy blow. A single strike to the chest or the neck, delivered with the same wheel or bar, intended to kill. Some sentences specified it. Others explicitly withheld it. The decision was made by the judge at sentencing, not by the executioner at the scaffold. For lesser offenses, the retentum came after the first limb. For the worst crimes, it was denied entirely. The condemned was placed on the wheel with every major bone below the neck shattered and left to die of exposure, shock, or thirst over a period of days. The difference between a death lasting minutes and a death lasting days was not decided by the executioner's hand in the moment. It was written into the court record weeks before the execution took place. Legal historian Richard van Dolman, in his 1990 analysis of early modern German criminal justice, documented multiple cases in which the retentum was explicitly withheld in the sentencing language, with the court specifying that the condemned was to remain alive on the wheel for the maximum possible duration. But here is where the reading of the wheel as lawless spectacle collapses entirely. The wheel was not lawless. It was the law. Every blow was prescribed. Every sequence was specified. Every variable, including whether the condemned would die in minutes or days, was determined by a judge sitting at a desk weeks before the scaffold was built. The retentum was not an act of mercy offered or withheld in the moment by a conflicted executioner. It was a line item in a sentencing document, weighed and debated with the same procedural care as a fine or a term of imprisonment. Somewhere in the archives of a German principality, there is a document in which a jurist weighed whether the mercy blow should follow the third limb or the fourth. Another jurist wrote a rebuttal. A clerk recorded both arguments. A judge made the final determination and signed his name. The wheel was not the failure of law. The wheel was law at its most detailed, its most specific, its most procedurally careful. The sentence was not carried out by men who had lost control. It was carried out by men who were following instructions written in the same hand and the same ink as every other provision of the criminal code. The most disturbing thing about breaking on the wheel is not the wheel. It is the penmanship. Number 3. The immurement. In 1938, a renovation crew working on a section of Kuressaare Castle in Estonia broke through an interior wall that had been sealed for centuries. The wall was thick, load-bearing, and appeared on no architectural plan as containing a cavity. Behind the stonework, in a space barely wide enough for a human torso, the crew found a skeleton. It was not lying down. It was not interred in any recognizable burial position. It was standing, compressed, with the skull turned toward the stone. The fingers were curled, and along the interior surface of the sealed cavity, in shallow grooves worn into the masonry itself, were marks that could only have been made by human hands. The crew had broken into a wall. What they found inside had been trying to break out. Immurement was not a single civilization's invention. It appeared independently across medieval Europe. ancient Persia, Mongol Central Asia, and feudal Japan. The method varied in its details, but the principle was universal. A living person was sealed inside a structure, a wall, a column, a chamber, a crypt, and left. No food, no water, no light, no exit. The sealed space became the world. In punitive immurement, the enclosure was typically just large enough for the body to stand, but not sit, or to sit, but not lie down. The stone was thick enough that no sound carried through it. The victim was not merely imprisoned, the victim was erased. From the moment the final stone was set in place, the person inside ceased to exist for anyone on the outside. The town continued. The wall held. Whatever happened inside the stone happened in silence. The experience inside the cavity can be reconstructed, approximately, from the physical evidence and from what is known about human physiology in sealed environments. Total darkness, absolute silence, or near silence, with only the sound of the victim's own breathing and heartbeat. The air supply was limited by the volume of the cavity. In a space roughly 60 centimeters wide, 40 centimeters deep, and 170 centimeters tall, the available air would sustain a conscious adult for a limited number of hours before carbon dioxide levels became debilitating. 60 centimeters is narrower than a standard door frame. The victim could not raise both arms simultaneously, could not turn around, could not sit without wedging the body downward against the stone on both sides. As the oxygen depleted, hypoxia would set in. Confusion first, then euphoria, paradoxically, then panic, as the body recognized what the brain had not yet accepted, then unconsciousness, then death. The entire process, from sealing to death, likely lasted between several hours and 2 days, depending on the volume of the cavity and the victim's metabolic rate. In medieval Christian Europe, there was a voluntary form. Anchorites and anchoresses chose to be sealed into small cells built against the walls of churches. They received food and water through a narrow window. They were never intended to leave. A funeral rite was performed before the cell was sealed. The anchorite was considered dead to the world. Julian of Norwich, the medieval English mystic, lived this way for decades. The distinction between punitive immurement and voluntary immurement appears absolute. One was a death sentence, the other was a spiritual practice, but the mechanical reality was closer than the theology suggests. Both involved a living person sealed in stone. Both involved the permanent surrender of movement, light, and the outside world. The difference was a window. Archaeological surveys conducted across Central and Eastern European medieval sites by Dr. Heike Valk of the University of Tartu in 2009 documented skeletal evidence consistent with living entombment in multiple fortification and ecclesiastical structures. But here is where the standard reading of immurement as an extreme punishment yields to something the evidence cannot contain: the scratch marks. When walls containing immurement victims have been opened centuries after they were sealed, the interior surfaces tell a story no chronicle ever recorded. Grooves in the stone, fingernail marks in the mortar, contorted skeletal positions inconsistent with passive death. The victims did not die quietly. They did not die quickly. They were conscious. They moved. They clawed at the walls in absolute darkness with no possibility of rescue. The first impossibility is that a civilization sealed people alive inside stone. The second impossibility, the one that resets everything, is that the stone recorded what happened after the last brick was laid. The wall was not a prison, it was a witness. And its testimony waited centuries for someone to open it. The question that immurement leaves behind is not how long the victim survived. That can be estimated. The question is what occupied the mind in total darkness, in a space too narrow to move, as the air thinned and no one came. The scratch marks are not evidence of escape attempts. The stone was too thick. The marks are too shallow. They were not trying to get through the wall. They were doing something else, something for which there is no clinical term and no comfortable interpretation. The marks remain in the stone. The fingernails that made them are dust. Whatever drove a person sealed alive in darkness to claw at a wall they knew they could not breach, that impulse, that final unnamed act, is the only record of what happened between the last stone and the last breath. No one wrote it down. The wall did. Number 2. The impalement, 20,000. That is the number recorded by multiple Ottoman chroniclers, describing what the army of Sultan Mehmed II encountered outside the city of Targoviste in 1462. Mehmed, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who had breached the most formidable walls in the medieval world, was leading an invasion force of over 90,000 soldiers into Wallachia to depose its prince, Vlad III. The army had marched for weeks. As it approached the Wallachian capital, the scouts reported something ahead that the officers initially could not interpret. It was not a fortification, it was not a battle line, it was a forest, but the shapes were wrong. The trunks were too uniform, too straight, too evenly spaced. And the smell reached the army before the details did. 20,000 wooden stakes, each between 5 and 9 meters tall, each bearing a human body in varying stages of death and decomposition, planted in rows across the field before the city. The technique had been refined. Vlad had not invented impalement, but he had studied it with a patience that his contemporaries found difficult to distinguish from madness. The stake was not sharpened to a point. It was oiled and rounded at the tip. This was not a mercy. A pointed stake would pierce organs and cause rapid internal hemorrhage. A rounded, oiled stake pushed the organs aside as the body's own weight drove it downward. The stake was inserted at the base of the torso and guided carefully, avoiding the heart, the lungs, and the major arteries. The goal was not penetration of vital structures. The goal was slow transit through the abdominal cavity while the major systems continued to function. Some accounts describe the stake emerging through the upper chest or the shoulder after a period of days. The victim remained conscious throughout the descent. Gravity was the executioner. The body's own weight was the force. The stake was simply the path. The field outside Targoviste was not a battlefield. It was a garden. The stakes were arranged in rows, at varying heights, with the most prominent captives elevated highest. Turkish prisoners, Wallachian traitors, political enemies, common criminals, each body at a different stage of the process. Some recently impaled, still moving, still making sounds, others silent for days, the body having completed its descent, the stake protruding from the upper torso, while the legs hung motionless. The smell of 20,000 bodies in various states of decomposition in the summer heat reached the Ottoman army from kilometers away. The flies were visible as a haze over the field. The sound, for the bodies still living, was a low collective moan that Ottoman sources described as unlike anything the soldiers had heard in any previous campaign. And these were soldiers who had stormed the walls of Constantinople. They had seen war at its most concentrated. The forest of stakes was not war, it was something else. The individual experience within the mass is what the number obscures. 20,000 is a statistic. One person on a stake, conscious, watching the daylight change overhead while gravity pulled the body imperceptibly downward along an oiled wooden shaft, is a human event. The descent was measured not in minutes but in hours and days. The victim could feel the stake moving internally, could feel the pressure change as the rounded tip pressed against different structures inside the abdomen, could hear the sounds from the other stakes, could see the birds circling, could see the army approaching in the distance, and know that rescue was not coming, because rescue was not the purpose. The purpose was the army seeing this. That was the entire design. Ottoman chronicler Tursun Beg, who accompanied the campaign, recorded the scene at Targoviste in a passage that historians regard as one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of mass impalement in existence. But here is where the tactical reading of impalement as psychological warfare falls apart. The tactical reading makes Vlad rational. It makes the stakes a strategy. And the strategy did work. Mehmed II, the man who conquered Constantinople, who commanded the largest army in the eastern Mediterranean, reportedly looked at the field of stakes and withdrew his forces. The conqueror turned around. But the tactical explanation does not account for the refinement. The oiling of the stakes, the rounding of the tips, the careful avoidance of vital organs. These were not field expedients. They were techniques that had been developed over multiple executions, tested, adjusted, and optimized for maximum survival time. The 20,000 stakes outside Targoviste were not the experiment. They were the production run. The research and development had happened earlier, in smaller batches, in sessions where someone watched and took notes on which angle of insertion produced the longest survival, which diameter of stake avoided the most organs, which oil reduced friction enough to slow the descent without stopping it. Mehmed II had broken through the walls of Constantinople. He had conquered the city that had resisted siege for 1,000 years, and he turned his army around because of what he saw in a field outside a minor Wallachian city. Not because of a battle, because of a garden. 20,000 stakes planted in rows, at varying heights, tended with agricultural patience. The bodies at different stages of descent, like crops at different stages of growth. A man who had conquered the most fortified city in the world looked at what another man had cultivated in a provincial field and calculated that the cost of proceeding was not worth the territory. The most effective fortification in medieval military history was not a wall. It was a demonstration of what one man was willing to do to human bodies, presented with the care and spacing of an orchard. Number 1. The SCAPHISM, a banquet. Wine and firelight. Soldiers and courtiers celebrating a military victory. In approximately 401 BCE, somewhere in the Persian Empire, a soldier named Mithridates was drinking and boasting. He had fought at the Battle of Cunaxa, where King Artaxerxes II had clashed with his brother Cyrus the Younger for control of the throne. Cyrus had been killed in the battle, and Mithridates, deep in his cups, made a claim that would cost him everything. He claimed that he, not the king, had struck the blow that killed Cyrus. The boast reached the throne. Artaxerxes was not a man who tolerated competition for his victories. The punishment devised for Mithridates was something that had no equivalent in any other recorded legal tradition. Plutarch, writing centuries later, struggled to find Greek words for it. The Persian term has not survived. What has survived is the description, and the description has haunted every civilization that has encountered it since. 2 hollowed-out boats, or wooden troughs, were fitted together to form a sealed shell around the body. Holes were cut for the head, hands, and feet to protrude. The victim was laid inside, and the 2 halves were fastened together so that no movement was possible. The body was locked in position. The face, the hands, and the feet were exposed. Everything else was enclosed. Then the feeding began. Milk and honey, mixed together, were poured into the victim's mouth until the stomach distended. More was smeared across the exposed face, the hands, the feet, and the eyelids. The mixture was then applied to the genitals and the anus. The combination of milk and honey in warm conditions ferments rapidly. It also attracts insects with extraordinary efficiency. Flies arrived first, then wasps, then beetles. The victim could not move, could not brush them away, could not close the hands, could not turn the head. The feeding was not a one-time event. It was repeated daily. Each day, the victim was given more milk and honey. Enough to sustain caloric intake, enough to prevent dehydration, enough to keep the body alive. The forced feeding was not cruelty layered onto the execution. It was the engineering that made the execution possible. A body left without food or water in the open would die within days. The milk and honey prevented that. They ensured that the system continued to function. Meanwhile, the diarrhea caused by the forced feeding accumulated inside the sealed boats. The fermenting mixture of excrement, milk, and honey in an enclosed space at ambient temperature created an environment of extraordinary biological activity. Insects laid eggs in the mixture and in the exposed flesh. Larvae hatched inside the living tissue. The body's immune response was overwhelmed. Infection spread through the soft tissue of the extremities first, then inward. The boats were set afloat on a stagnant pond. No current. No wave action. The still water bred mosquitoes and additional insects. The surface of the pond became a nursery. The victim could see the sky, could feel the sun on the exposed face, could hear the insects before feeling them, could feel the larvae moving inside wounds that grew wider each day. And each morning, the attendants returned, opened the boats enough to pour more milk and honey into the victim's mouth, reapplied the mixture to the exposed skin, and closed the boats again. The process was maintained the way a gardener maintains a plot: daily feeding, daily tending, daily observation. Plutarch records that Mithridates survived for 17 days. The number was corroborated by the Byzantine chronicler Zonaras, drawing on sources that may no longer exist. 17 days. The human body, properly fed and hydrated, sustained consciousness for 17 days while insects colonized its living tissue from the outside in. Dr. Adrienne Mayer of Stanford University, in her 2010 analysis of ancient biological warfare and execution methods, concluded that the protocol described by Plutarch was biologically plausible, that forced caloric sustenance combined with sustained insect exposure could indeed extend conscious survival to the durations recorded. But here is where the nightmare begins. The horror of scaphism is not its cruelty. Every method on this list is cruel. The horror is its coherence. Every single element solves a specific engineering problem. The body would dehydrate and die too quickly. Solution: force-feed milk and honey daily. The immune system would fight localized infection. Solution: overwhelm it with sustained, distributed colonization across every exposed surface simultaneously. The victim might die of shock. Solution: the caloric intake from honey and the hydration from milk provide the metabolic resources to maintain consciousness. The stagnant water ensures consistent insect density and prevents the body from cooling below survivable temperatures. Scaphism is not an act of rage. It is a system, a protocol. Someone sat with the problem of how to keep a human body alive during its own consumption and solved it the way an engineer solves a structural problem, by identifying every failure point and addressing each one in sequence. The force-feeding protocol, keeping a body nourished and sustained against its will while it deteriorates from within, is not an idea that died with the Persian Empire. It is a mechanical logic that has resurfaced in modern detention facilities, in end-of-life care debates, in the legal and ethical arguments about what it means to keep a body alive when the body has ceased to benefit from living. The ancient question and the modern question share the same engineering core. How do you sustain biological function in a body that, if given the choice, would stop? The Persians answered it with milk and honey in a stagnant pond. The answer has changed. The question has not. The boats are gone. The pond is gone. Mithridates is gone. What remains is the design, a system for keeping a human body conscious during its own decomposition, refined to the point where the limiting factor was not the method but the biology itself. 17 days. Not because the technique failed at 17 days. Because the human body's capacity to sustain awareness while being consumed from the outside reached its absolute physiological boundary at 17 days. A civilization identified that boundary, not by accident, by iteration, by observation, by someone watching and counting the days and adjusting the protocol until the number stopped increasing. The answer to how long a human being can be kept alive inside their own decay is 17 days. And the only reason that number exists is that someone wanted to find out. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.